Hello, Zer0 Books readers. You may have noticed that we've started running video live streams of our Herding Cats reading group on Marx's Capital, Volume 1. The participants in the group have primarily been some dirty rotten commies in Alabama, but I've also started inviting Patreon supporters to join in the chat as well. And starting last month, I began releasing videos that perhaps quixotically summarized sections or chapters from Capital. These videos are in no way meant to be an adequate substitute for the text itself, but rather the hope is that by releasing these videos, I can entice people to get a hold of Marx's big book and start reading along. This video will attempt to summarize Capital, Volume 1, Chapter 2, entitled The Process of Exchange. What I want to do is point out one rather strange assertion that Marx makes in the text. He writes that when people trade objects, say when they exchange one coat for 20 yards of linen, they lose their freedom and their individuality. This may seem to be hyperbolic, even unreasonable, but it makes some sense if you turn the causal relationship around. It's not that people are dominated by objects when they exchange them, but more that people grant objects power when they set up an exchange. Marx is explaining how commodities gain dominance. In fact, what Marx is telling us is a story of how commodities come into existence at all, and then what the consequences of their existence is for society. There are really two sorts of exchanges that Marx wants the reader to consider. The first is the exchange of commodities as we know them under capitalism, and the other is the simple exchange of two useful things in a pre-capitalist setting. Marx tells us how these exchanges are different. And this difference can best be understood if we consider the kind of social relation that is formed even when we participate in a simple exchange of useful things, and then consider what happens to that relationship between people, what must occur if that sort of simple exchange becomes a regular practice within a society. Marx talks about primitive communities as a location for simple exchanges of useful things. But I want to turn to an analogy and have us consider a family instead. In fact, let's take up the idea of an exchange in a very specific circumstance that occurs within the family. Let's think of two brothers who might exchange candy bars on Halloween. Consider it now. Noah and Simon are two young boys with hippie parents. After a night of trick-or-treating, they are told that the candy they procured will be combined together into one communal pot that everyone in the family will share. Being very young, say 5 and 7, they can't but agree to this arrangement, and their individual bags of candy are poured into a bowl together and placed on the kitchen table. The two boys and their father take seats at the kitchen table and proceed to pick out candies from the massive bowl. They eat and eat. The pile of candy gets smaller and smaller. Nausea sets in. When only a few candies remain, Noah takes the last Butterfinger and Simon takes a packet of Starbursts. However, Noah feels ill and doesn't really want to eat another Butterfinger. He doesn't really like Butterfingers. Simon, likewise, is no longer a fan of the fruity sweetness of a Starburst fruit chew. However, when Simon spots Noah's Butterfinger, he remembers that Butterfingers are, in fact, his favorite. Noah, for his part, loves the chewy sweetness of a Starburst. They decide to exchange one Butterfinger for one packet of Starbursts. One packet of Starbursts for one Butterfinger. Up until that moment of exchange, the candy they were selecting from the bowl was simply candy, and it was meant to be eaten. But after they exchange the candy, each considers the situation differently. They see that Butterfingers are equal to Starbursts, and that Starbursts are equal to Butterfingers.
And this is actually a description of the kind of legal and political framework for properly functioning markets. And in that context, he points out, the commodities are, as he says on 179, born levelers and cynics. is always ready to exchange not only soul but body with each and every other commodity. The owner is willing to dispose of it, the buyer is willing to take it. As he says, all commodities are non-use values for their owners and use values for their non-owners. Consequently, they must all change hands.
Let's consider or imagine that a year passes for our two trick-or-treaters, and that this time the boys refuse to put their candy in a community bowl, but hold on to their loot both for their own consumption and with the aim of trading. What will be worked out this second time is something more like a fair exchange rate based on trick-or-treating. That is, if they found that it's more time-consuming to track down Butterfingers than it is to track down packets of Starbursts, then they may end up exchanging something like 2 packets of Starbursts for 1 Butterfinger. As long as neither boy has developed a taste for the other's favorite candy, this exchange of Butterfingers and Starbursts will have been firmly established. But the trick-or-treat analogy breaks down at this point because it can only be a once-a-year affair, and as much as boys might like Butterfingers, their way of life won't be altered by the exchanges they're making. It's all perfectly innocent, really, until we introduce money.
Money necessarily crystallizes out of the process of exchange. And the historical broadening and deepening of the phenomenon of exchange develops the opposition between use value and value, which is latent in the nature of the commodity. The need to give an external expression to this opposition for the purposes of commercial intercourse produces the drive towards an independent form of value which finds neither rest nor peace until an independent form has been achieved by the differentiation of commodities into commodities and money.
For to return to our trick-or-treat analogy, in order to understand this, we might imagine a world where children had to scavenge and beg to survive. A world that was one perpetual Halloween. It might be possible in such a world that Starbursts would become a kind of currency. These children would have lost some of their freedom. They would have lost the connections of the family and been atomized and become independent. And before we leave off this analogy altogether, I want us to think of this kid, maybe Simon, who would be living on his own in a treehouse in a Halloween world, relying on his ability to collect Starburst fruit juice to survive. And we might think of him sitting there in his wooden box up in a maple tree, still in his Aquaman costume, feeling cold and hungry for food that isn't sweet. We might imagine him staring down at his loot, at the Starbursts, and wondering how it is that he came to rely on them for so much in his life. Just what are these fruit chews, and why do they dominate him? And that's the question we'll take up next month in Chapter 3 when we consider money or the circulation of commodities.